I didn't want the house. I want to be clear about that from the start, because I've turned it over so many times since, wondering if some part of me knew what I was walking into, and went anyway. My grandfather left it to me when he passed, a narrow 2-story place off Route 9, with a tin roof that sang in the rain, and a porch that sagged toward the holler like it was tired of standing. I was tired too. My mother had died that spring, slow and hard, and I'd spent those last months at her bedside, watching the woman who raised me shrink down to something the size of a child. When it was over, I couldn't stand my apartment in the city anymore. Every room in it had her voice in it somehow. So when the lawyer called about the house, it felt less like an inheritance and more like an escape hatch, somewhere quiet, somewhere she'd never been, where I wouldn't turn a corner and expect to see her. That was the whole reason I went. That's the part that eats at me now. The first weeks were good, or at least they were empty in the way I needed. I fixed what I could: the porch step, the gutter, the back door that wouldn't latch. The nearest neighbor was a mile down the ridge, an old man named Elias, who kept goats and didn't say much, and beyond that it was just trees and the long gravel throat of Route 9 winding down toward town. At night the dark up there was total. City dark is never really dark. There's always a street light, a passing car, the glow of somebody else's window. But up on that ridge, when the sun went behind the mountain, the black came down like a lid on a jar. I'd sit at the kitchen table with one lamp burning and feel the whole weight of the woods pressing in against the glass. And for the first time since Mama passed, I slept. It started on a Tuesday. I remember because I'd driven into town that afternoon for groceries, and the girl at the register had wished me a happy Tuesday, and I'd thought how strange it was that a day could have a name and still mean nothing. That night, I was washing my dinner plate at the sink when I caught movement in the kitchen window. Not a sound, just a shifting in the black square of glass above the faucet, where the lamplight threw my own reflection back at me against the dark. A shape, tall and pale and still, standing out past the edge of the yard where the tree line began. I froze with the plate in my hand. Then I made myself breathe and told myself what a reasonable person tells himself. It was the dogwood. There was an old dogwood out there, half dead, its bare branches catching the moon at a bad angle. I'd seen it 100 times in daylight. I turned off the tap and looked again, and the shape was still there, and I stood watching it for a long minute until my heart slowed, and then I did the thing I've regretted most. I looked away. I set the plate in the rack, and when I looked back, the shape had leaned closer. Branches don't do that. Branches don't lean closer when you turn your back. I pulled the little curtain across the window and went to bed and lay awake a long time, and in the morning the dogwood stood right where it always had, and I felt like a fool. The second night I heard my name. I was upstairs, half asleep, and it came up through the floorboards from the kitchen below. Soft, patient, a woman's voice pronouncing my name the way you'd say it, to wake a sleeping child without startling them. I sat up so fast, the blood roared in my ears. I told myself it was a dream bleeding into waking. But I heard it again, and this time the voice hitched on the second syllable in a way I knew, in a way that turned my stomach to water, because it sounded like her. It sounded like my mother. I didn't go downstairs. I want you to understand I'm not a brave man, and I have never once regretted not going down those stairs. I lay rigid until the gray light came, and when I finally crept down, the kitchen was empty, the curtains still drawn, and the only sound was the tin roof ticking as the morning warmed it. I kept the curtains shut after that, all of them, every window, drawn tight the moment the sun touched the ridge. But the whispering learned. That's the only way I know to say it. It learned. The third night, it was just my name again, over and over, coming from the kitchen glass. But the fourth night, it started to know things. It called me by the name my mother used, a soft, foolish nickname from when I was small that no one else on this earth had ever spoken, that I had never told a living soul, that had gone into the ground with her that spring. I stood in the dark hallway with my hand pressed over my mouth and listened to that voice say it through the glass, gentle and coaxing, and then it began to hum. It hummed the lullaby she used to sing me, the one with the made-up words she never got right the same way twice. And it got them wrong in exactly her way, the same stumble in the same place. And then, worst of all, between the humming it breathed, and the breath had a hitch in it, a wet little catch on the intake that I had spent 3 months listening to at her bedside as her lungs gave out, a sound I would know in the dark until the day I die. Whatever stood in that yard had that sound down perfect. I called my sister in Ohio the next morning. My hands were shaking so bad I dropped the phone twice. I didn't know how to say it without sounding like I'd come unglued, so I just started talking, told her about the voice, the nickname, the lullaby, the breathing, and she went quiet. A long quiet, the kind where you can hear the other person deciding how careful they need to be with you. Then she said gently that she didn't understand how any of that could be Mama's voice coming from that house, because Mama had never lived there. Mama had never so much as set foot in Appalachia, not once in her whole life. She'd hated the mountains, wouldn't visit Grandpa. The two of them barely spoke. I'd known that, somewhere. I'd forgotten it in my grief. And the understanding came over me slow and cold, right there with the phone against my ear. Whatever was out in that yard had never met my mother. It had never heard her voice. It couldn't have. It only knew what I had brought to it. All those nights I'd sat at the kitchen table with the lamp on, grieving, talking to myself the way lonely people do, humming that lullaby under my breath, saying her name into the empty house. It had been out there in the dark the whole time, listening, gathering me up piece by piece, and then it had taken all my grief and all my loneliness and stitched them together into a shape that fit the exact hole she'd left in me. And it had put her voice on like a coat, and it had come to the window to try it on. Here is the part I have never told anyone, the part I'm ashamed of. The worst thing was not the fear. The worst thing was how badly I wanted it. By the 7th night, I hadn't slept in days, and the voice out there was so kind, so patient, so completely her, and I was so tired of the silence where she used to be. It didn't threaten me. It never once threatened me. It only grieved with me, called me by my child name, and told me through the glass that it was cold out there, and it missed me, and it only wanted to see my face. And I found myself standing at the kitchen window on that 7th night with my hand on the edge of the curtain, my fingers actually curled in the fabric, wanting more than I have ever wanted anything, just to pull it back and see her one more time. I knew it wouldn't be her. Some clear, cold part of me at the very back of my skull knew exactly what was on the other side of that glass, and knew it was not my mother, and never had been. But knowing didn't touch the wanting. The wanting was a physical thing. A hand on the back of my neck pushing me forward, and the curtain was already sliding in my grip. And the whisper on the other side went very soft and very glad. Like it knew, like it had been waiting all week for just this moment. What stopped me was the goats. Elias's goats, a mile down the ridge, started screaming all at once in the dark. That awful, almost human sound goats make when something's among them. And it broke whatever spell I was under. My hand came off the curtain, my legs went out, and I sat down hard on the kitchen floor, and I stayed there shaking until the sun came up. And that morning I got in my truck, and I drove down to Elias's place, and I asked him, straight out, if there was something wrong with that house. He looked at me for a long time. Then he told me about the others. There'd been people up and down that ridge over the years. He said, folks who'd come to those quiet houses carrying some grief or another, and some of them had kept their curtains open. He said it like that, plain, kept their curtains open, and something in the way he said it made me cold all over. He said, those houses sat empty now, that if you went up to them, you'd find the doors unlocked, and dishes still in the drying rack and beds unmade, everything just left, like the people had stepped out one night to go say hello to somebody in the yard and simply never come back inside. He said, the mountain took the lonely ones, said it had a way of learning what a person was missing and becoming exactly that. And then he told me to leave and not to look back at the house when I drove away, and not to answer if I heard my name. I left that afternoon. I didn't pack much. I couldn't stand to be in the house past dark, and I made it out before the 8th night, and I did not look back the way he told me, kept my eyes hard on the gravel, the whole way down, even when I thought I heard, under the sound of the tires, a voice calling the little name my mother gave me. I sold the place through the lawyer without ever setting foot in it again. I live 2 states away now, in a city, in an apartment on the 4th floor, where the nights are never really dark, and there's always a street light and a passing car. And for a long time, I thought that was the end of it, that I'd gotten out in time, that distance and concrete and other people's windows would be enough. But grief travels. That's the thing nobody tells you. It followed me down off that mountain the way it had waited for me up on it. Some nights late, when the city has finally gone quiet, I hear it against the glass of my bedroom window, 4 floors up where nothing living could stand. A soft, patient tapping, the same rhythm every time, the way you'd knock to wake a sleeping child without startling them. And then the whisper comes. It found me. I don't know how, but it found me. And it's had all this time to practice, all these long nights alone, to gather up the newer grief and the newer loneliness I carry now, and it's better than it was. It doesn't stumble on the lullaby anymore. And it's finally, after all this time, gotten my name exactly right. Not the child name my mother used, but my own. The way only I say it inside my own head, the private way I've never spoken aloud to anyone. It says my name against the glass, soft and glad and certain, and every single night I lie there in the dark with my hands fisted in the blanket, and I do not look at the window, and I tell myself I won't, and I am so tired, and it is so kind, and it is so patient, and it has nothing but time. The realtor called it a bargain, and I suppose in the way of things that are cheap, for a reason it was. A cabin at the bottom of a holler, the kind of low fold in the land where 2 ridges come down to meet and the water goes to gather. I'd wanted quiet and I'd wanted cheap, being newly divorced and newly poor, in the way divorce makes a man, and that little place off the county road gave me both in abundance. What I didn't understand then, what nobody bothers to spell out to a flatlander with cash in hand, is that there's a difference between quiet and empty, and that some places are quiet the way a held breath is quiet. The holler was one of those. The fog sat in it like milk in the bottom of a bowl, and never fully lifted, not even at noon in high summer, and the rain when it came didn't run off the way. Rain should but pooled thick and slow in the yard, and stood there for days, brown and patient, mirroring the gray sky back up at itself. The old men at the feed store tried to warn me in their way. When I mentioned where I'd bought, a quiet came over the 2 or 3 of them near the register, and one of them said the low ground down, there was bad ground, and I'd have done better up on a ridge. I took it for the usual thing. Mountain folk being wary of outsiders, and outsiders being wary right back, and I figured they meant the flooding, the way that standing water would rot my sills and breed mosquitoes thick as smoke. I thanked them, and I didn't listen because I was 38 years old. And I believed, the way you believe before you've been taught otherwise, that the world was made of things that had reasons, and that a bad feeling was just a feeling and not a warning, that some older part of you was trying to pass up to the front. The first storm came my second week. I remember I was standing at my bedroom window, watching the rain come down in those heavy ropes it comes down in, when the whole sky lets go at once, and out at the tree line, where the yard gave up and the woods began, there was a figure, a person, pale, standing perfectly still in the downpour and facing the house. Facing my window, it seemed, though the distance and the rain made it hard to be sure. I stood there a long moment with my heart doing something slow and uncertain in my chest, and then I told myself the sensible thing. It was late. I was tired, bone-tired in the way that new grief and new solitude make you tired. It was a stump, or a pale snag of deadfall, or a trick the water made against the dark trees. I closed the curtain, and I went to bed, and in the morning there was nothing at the tree line but trees, and I felt the particular embarrassment of a grown man who has frightened himself. But the next storm, it was closer. That's the thing I keep coming back to, the thing my mind still circles at 3 in the morning. It only ever came in the rain. On dry nights, the yard was just a yard, empty and ordinary, the standing water gone glassy and still. And on those nights, I could almost laugh at myself, almost put the whole thing away in the drawer where you keep the foolish things you once believed. But when the storms came, and they came often down in that holler, the figure came with them. The second storm, it stood at the fence line, halfway across the yard from where it had been, still pale, still perfectly motionless, still turned to face my window, with the rain sheeting down over it, running down its face and its shoulders, and it never once flinched from the water, never wiped its eyes, never blinked it away, the way a living person can't help but do. It just stood and faced me, and let the storm pour over it like it was a fence post, like it was a thing the weather happened to, rather than a thing that felt it. I didn't sleep well after that, and worse for the not sleeping, I started watching for it. The third storm put it in the middle of the yard. The fourth brought it just past the old well, close enough now that I could make out that it wore something, some pale drab clothing, gone colorless, and that its arms hung straight down at its sides, in a way that arms don't hang when a person is standing and thinking and being a person. And it was somewhere in there, around the fourth or the fifth storm, that I understood the thing that took the last of my sleep away for good. It never moved while I watched it. Not once. I could stand at that window for an hour, with my eyes fixed on it, and it would not so much as sway, and I'd start to think, I'd imagined the whole progression, that it had always stood right there. But the yard fog would gather on the cold glass, and I'd have to lift my hand and wipe it clear. And in that half second, that little smear of blindness, while my palm crossed the pane, it would be closer. Or a gust would throw rain hard against the house, and I'd glance to check the storm, and back, closer. Or my own tired eyes would drop for just a moment to the sill, and back, closer. It moved only in the spaces I couldn't see it. It advanced only through the gaps in my attention, gaining ground in the exact measure that I failed to hold it. So that the very act of watching, which should have kept me safe, was the thing that couldn't be sustained long enough to matter. A man has to blink. A man has to wipe the fog from the glass. And it knew that, or it simply was that, a thing shaped to the failures of a watcher's eye. I started counting the storms by how close it stood. That was how I measured time down in that holler by the end. Not in days, but in storms. And not in storms, but in feet of yard remaining. 6 storm, and it stood just off the porch. Close enough now that I'd stopped being able to pretend. Close enough that I could see its face was a face, though the rain and the fog kept the particulars from me. I stopped sleeping in any real way. I'd doze in the dry hours and jerk awake at the first far rumble of thunder and go to the window and stand my watch, wiping the glass, holding my eyes open till they burned, and every storm gave it back a few more feet, no matter how hard I watched. It was the counting that finally drove me down to the feed store to ask, though I could barely make the words come out, without sounding like a man who'd lost his grip. There was an old fellow there I'd seen before, older than the others, and when the rest of them went quiet at my questions, he didn't. He looked at me for a while, and then he said his father had spoken of a thing like that, down in the low hollers where the water gathered. Called it a rain waiter, he said, or that was the closest he could put it to plain English. He said his father claimed it wasn't a haint exactly, and wasn't a living man, and wasn't quite either, that it was something that belonged to the wet low ground, the way mold belongs to a cellar. And that all it ever wanted, the only wanting it had, was to get inside. Out of the rain was how his father put it, though the old man said that plain, and then his mouth went tight, like he didn't believe the simple version any more than I did. And then he told me the thing I have never been able to set down since, he said. The mistake folks always made, the fatal mistake, was thinking a locked door would count for anything. Because a thing that has already spent 30 or 40 or 50 years crossing a single yard, gaining a few feet a storm, patient past any human patience, a thing like that has all the time there is. A lock is nothing to it. A wall is nothing. The only thing that had ever kept the low grounds rain waiter out of a house, he said, was the folks in that house being gone before it finished the crossing. And most weren't. Most stayed and watched, the way I'd been watching, right up until the last storm. I drove home cold all the way through. And I want to tell you, I packed and left that afternoon like a sensible man. But the truth is, I didn't, because the sun was out, and the yard was empty and dry, and in the daylight the whole thing felt like the raving of 2 frightened men, the old one and me. So I stayed one more night, and that night the 7th storm came in. I heard it start well after dark, the first fat drops on the tin roof building, fast into that full roar, and I went to the window the way I always did, and it was already there, pressed right up against the glass. So close, there was no yard left between us at all. Close enough that its pale face filled the whole lower pane, and the fog of its breath. Its breath, God help me, it had breath, bloomed and shrank on the cold glass an inch from my own face. And in the flat gray light of that storm, I finally saw the face clear, and I understood, and the understanding is the thing that will be with me at the end of my life. It was my face, older than mine, years older, worn down and hollowed out, the eyes sunk deep, and the cheeks fallen in like a man who'd been standing in the cold rain of a low holler for a very long time and had let it wear him down to almost nothing. It was me, or it was what waited to be me, and it looked at me through the glass with my own exhausted eyes, and its mouth began to move. It was saying something, mouthing words slow and deliberate right against the pane, trying so hard to make me understand, and I couldn't hear a single word over the roar of the rain on the roof. And I have thanked God for that, and cursed God for that, in equal measure every day since, because I don't know if it was a warning or an invitation, and I never will. I ran. I left everything I owned in that cabin, and I ran out into the storm in my socks, and got the truck started with my hands shaking, So bad I could barely turn the key, and I drove up out of that holler in the pouring dark, with the water coming down the road at me in sheets. I made the county road, and I made the highway, and I didn't stop, wouldn't have stopped for anything. And it was somewhere on that highway with the rain finally thinning against the windshield that I made myself look up into the rearview mirror, just to be sure, just to see the road empty behind me and know I'd gotten clear. The road was empty, but the passenger window, the one beside the empty seat next to me, had begun to fog, not from the outside where the rain ran down it, from the inside. A slow bloom of breath spreading across the glass from within the cab, low down, right about where a face might be, if a face were pressed close and patient, and finally, after all its long crossing, in out of the rain. I did not turn my head. I have never in my life wanted so badly not to turn my head. I kept my eyes on the road, and I drove, and I have kept driving, in one way or another, ever since. And I will tell you that I moved to high dry ground far from any holler, and I will tell you that I've been fine for a long while now. But it does still rain, even on high ground, and on the nights when it comes down hard against the windows, I feel the old want to go and stand watch. And I make myself stay in bed instead, and I do not look, and I try not to think about how a thing that has already crossed one whole yard, one whole highway, one whole state, has nothing left to learn about patience, and all the time there is. I moved up onto that ridge in the fall, when the leaves were turning, and the light came slantwise and gold through the trees, and for the first few days, I thought I'd found the closest thing to peace I was ever going to get. The house was old but sound, a plain white farmhouse, set high on the shoulder of the mountain, with a front room that looked out and down over the valley. The way old mountain houses are built to do, so a body sitting by the window can watch the road below and see who's coming and going. I'd come up there to get away from people, if I'm honest. I'd worn out my welcome in a lot of places, and worn out a lot of people's patience with me, and the idea of a house where the nearest neighbor was a mile off, and the only thing at my window was a valley full of trees, sounded like something close to heaven. I didn't know yet that a house built to watch the road is a house that has already learned how to want somebody to come up it. She appeared the first week. It was full dark, past 9, and I was in the front room with a lamp on and a drink in my hand, when something at the edge of the yard caught my eye. Down where the mown grass gave out and the tree line started, at the far corner of the property, near where the old lane came up from the valley road. A woman. She stood there in the near dark, in a house dress, pale blue, the kind of shapeless cotton thing old women wore to do their kitchen work 50 years ago. And she was waving at me. Not a frantic wave, not a wave for help. A slow, warm, side-to-side arc of the arm, the exact gentle motion of a neighbor who's spotted you across a fence and wants you to know she's glad you're there. It caught me so off guard, and it was so friendly that I did the natural thing. I lifted my own hand and waved back. And I thought, well, isn't that something? Somebody's walked up to welcome the new fellow to the ridge, and I half expected her to start up the yard toward the porch so I could go out and meet her. She didn't. She just kept waving. I stood there at the window a while, waiting for the gesture to resolve into something, an approach, a called greeting, anything, and it never did. She stayed at the tree line and she waved, that same slow, patient arc, over and over. After a few minutes, it stopped being neighborly and started being strange, and I set down my drink and looked harder. But the dark and the distance kept her face from me, just the pale dress and the pale moving arm. I told myself she was maybe simple or old and confused, one of those folks who wander at night, and I felt I ought to do something, But something else in me, something with better sense than the front of my mind, did not want to go out into that yard. So I watched, and she waved. And I am not exaggerating when I tell you she waved for 3 hours. I timed it against the clock on the mantel because I couldn't quite believe it. 3 hours of that same slow arm, never tiring, never dropping, never changing, until finally near dawn, my nerve gave out, and I pulled the curtains shut and sat in the closed room with my heart going, and told myself I'd sort it out in daylight. In daylight, of course, the tree line was empty. Every night after that, she was there. I'd hold out as long as I could, keep the curtains drawn, keep my eyes on the television or a book. But the pull to check was always too much, and every time I twitched that curtain back, she'd be down at the corner of the yard, pale in the dark, waving. I stopped sleeping right. I started asking around town, careful, not wanting to sound like a man who'd come unhinged in his lonesome new house. But I mentioned it here and there. A woman in a blue dress on my property at night. Most folks just gave me the flat mountain look. That means they've decided you're either lying or losing it. But there was an old woman I fell into talk with after the little church service one Sunday, and when I described the dress and the waving and where she stood, the color went right out of that old woman's face. She got quiet and she took my arm, and she told me the house I'd bought had belonged long back to a widow, a woman whose husband had died young, and whose children had gone off down the mountain and never much come back, and who'd spent the last years of her life sitting in that very front room by that very window, watching the valley road, waving at every car and every walker that passed below. Lonely past bearing, the old woman said, waving folks up, hoping just once somebody would turn off the road and come up the lane and stop and sit with her a while. And in all those years, the old woman said, nobody ever did. She died in that front room, in her chair, facing the window, waving at a road nobody turned off of. Well, that broke my heart, I'll be honest. It made me feel low and ashamed, because here I'd been frightened of a poor, lonely, dead woman who'd only ever wanted company, and the thought of all those years of her waving at an empty road put a genuine grief in me. That night, when she appeared at the corner of the yard, I didn't feel the fear I'd felt before. I felt sorry for her. I lifted my hand and gave her a long, kind wave back, the way you'd want somebody to wave at you if you'd been lonely 50 years. And I said out loud through the glass, though she couldn't have heard it, that I was sorry nobody ever came. And that, I think now, was the worst mistake I made. Because pity opened a door in me that fear had kept shut, and something on the other side of it felt the door swing. It was a few nights after that I understood I'd had the whole thing wrong. I'd been telling myself she was greeting me, waving hello, the way she'd waved at the road. But that's not what the gesture was, and once I saw it true, I couldn't unsee it. She wasn't waving hello, she was beckoning. The arm didn't arc side to side like a greeting after all. It swept in toward herself, the unmistakable motion of someone calling you over. Come here, come down. Come to me. And now that I understood what she was saying, she seemed to understand that I understood, and the waving changed. It got faster, more insistent. The gentle, patient arc turned hungry, urgent, the arm pumping the come her motion over and over, and her smile. I could see her smile now, though I still couldn't rightly see her eyes. Her smile spread. It spread too far. It stretched up her face wider than a smile has any business going, a great pale hungry crescent in the dark, and it did not waver and it did not close. And behind it, the beckoning arm called and called and called me down. And here is the thing I have the hardest time making anybody believe, the thing that turned it from a haunting into a fight for my life. When she beckoned, I felt it, not in my mind, in my body, an actual physical pull, A tug low in my chest and behind my ribs, like a hook had been set in me, and a line ran down through the glass and across the yard to her hand, and every sweep of her arm gave that line a slow, steady haul. It rattled something loose in me. I'd be sitting in my chair with the curtain drawn, and I'd feel it pulling even through the cloth, the wanting, the come down, come to me, and it wore at my sense the way water wears at a bank. Twice. I came back to myself standing at the front door with my hand already on the latch, the door half drawn open onto the black porch, and the cold, and no memory at all of getting up out of my chair and crossing the room. Twice I came to like a man, surfacing from deep water, gasping, and slammed that door and threw the bolt and backed away from it shaking, because I knew clear as anything, that if I ever once got that door open and set a foot out onto that porch and started down toward her, I would not be coming back up. She'd waved for 100 years for somebody to come. She was not going to let the one who finally started down turn around. The last night I stayed on that ridge, I'll carry to my grave. I'd resolved to leave in the morning, had my bag half packed, was just going to get through one more dark and drive out at first light. But the pull that night was worse than it had ever been, so bad. I sat in the far corner of the house, with the front room shut off entirely, and still I felt it hauling. And near the middle of the night, I heard something I'd never heard before in all those weeks. A sound on the porch boards. A soft, dragging, shuffling step right outside the front door. She'd never left the tree line. In all that time, she had never once crossed the yard. But the shuffling came again, and against my every good sense, I went to the front room and looked at the door, which had a pane of glass set in the top of it, and she was there, on my porch. Her face pressed near the glass, that stretched crescent smile filling it, that arm still going, come to me, right up against my own door. And behind her, crowded on the porch and down the steps, and out into the pale-lit yard, stood others, a dozen of them, more, men and women both in old drab clothes, gone colorless with age and rot, farm clothes, and Sunday clothes, and children's clothes, every one of them turned toward my door, every one of them smiling that same too-wide smile, every one of them slowly, patiently waving me down. All the ones I understood, who over all those long years had finally answered. All the ones who'd gotten up out of their chairs one night, with a hook set in their chests, and started down the lane to say hello, and never came back up. And she'd gathered them. She wasn't lonely anymore. That was the thing that finally moved my frozen legs. The understanding that she had plenty of company now, that the company was exactly the point, and that they had all come up onto my porch to welcome me into it. I went out the back. I don't remember most of it, only that I was in my truck and down the far side of the ridge on the old logging road before I was hardly awake to what I was doing. And I did not come back for my things. Not ever, not once, not even in daylight, with another man beside me. I called the realtor and let the bank have the place, and I have never in the years since gone within 20 miles of that mountain. But I'll tell you what stays with me, what I think about on the bad nights. It isn't the dozen of them on the porch, though God knows that's enough. It's the pull. Because I got away, I got clear, but the hook was set that last night, and I don't believe it ever fully came out. Some evenings, when the light goes slantwise and gold, and I catch a glimpse through my own window of anybody, at all lifting a hand in a wave, I feel the smallest tug behind my ribs, the faintest come to me, and I have to sit down and hold onto the arms of my chair and wait for it to pass. She waited 100 years for somebody to come up. I have the terrible feeling she doesn't mind waiting a while longer for me. The house came to me the way these places always seem to, through a death and a will and a family, too scattered to argue over it. It had been my great uncle's, set back off a dirt road in a stretch of the mountains, where the hollers run deep, and the trees close over the lane. So thick you drive through green tunnels in the summer and bare gray ones in the winter. I'd never met the man. He'd lived up there alone the last 30 years of his life, and died alone in it. And when the lawyer read out that he'd left the place to me, of all the people he could have picked, I took it for luck. I was between things then, between jobs, between women, between the person I'd been and whoever I was going to turn into next. And a paid-off house in the quiet mountains sounded like exactly the kind of nowhere a man could go to figure himself out. I loaded what I owned into a truck and drove up in October, and I want you to understand that I went up there happy. That's the part that's hard to hold on to now. It was a plain old farmhouse, 2 stories, white paint gone gray, and the first thing I did the first afternoon was walk it, room to room, getting the feel of it. And I remember counting the windows, not because anything told me to, but just the idle way you take stock of a new place. And I remember landing on the number 11. 11 windows in the whole house. 4 across the front, a couple on each side, 2 in the back. And then, down in the low dark of the cellar, where the fieldstone foundation met the earth, 1 small window at the back, not much bigger than a hymnal, that my great-uncle had boarded over from the inside at some point with a couple of rough planks and a fistful of nails. I noticed it, and I thought nothing of it. Old men board up drafty cellar windows all the time. I put it out of my head, and I finished unpacking, and that first night I slept fine, better than I had in months, with the deep mountain quiet lying over the house like a heavy quilt. It was the 3rd or 4th night that it started, and it started so small I almost slept through it. A voice, outside, low and flat, out past the east wall of the house. It said 1 word. It said 1. Just that, in a voice with no lift or fall to it at all. A voice like a man reading numbers off a page he's read 10,000 times before. Then there was a sound of feet in the fallen leaves, a slow dragging shuffle moving along the side of the house, and after a moment, further along, the voice said, 2. I lay there in the dark with my eyes open. 3, it said, further still, having rounded toward the back now. 4. And it kept on, circling the house in the leaves, counting off a number at each window it passed. And my first thought, my sensible Flatlander first thought, was that some drifter had wandered up the road and found the isolated house and was casing it, counting windows to find his way in. That thought put a cold anger in me more than fear. And I got up, and I got my great-uncle's old rifle down from over the mantel where it had hung, and I loaded it, and I sat in the dark front room, with it across my knees, waiting for a face at the glass, ready to run the man off. But the man never came to a window, not to be seen straight on, and as the hour wore by, my anger cooled into something worse, because I began to notice the things that didn't add up. The voice never tired. Round after round it went. 1, 2, 3, on, and no man's voice stays that level. Hour after hour. No man breathes that even after circling a house 100 times. And the feet in the leaves never quickened and never slowed. The same patient shuffle every single time. No stumble, no pause to rest, all through the deep middle of the night. I'd catch now and then a suggestion at the edge of a window as it passed. A tall shape, taller than a tall man, moving slow through the dark, seeming to turn its head and look in through the glass for the length of one held breath before it moved on to the next. I never saw a face. I never saw it whole. Just that impression of great patient height sliding past the panes, counting. And I sat frozen with a loaded rifle. I somehow understood would be no use at all, and I did not fire, and I did not move, until at last the gray light came up in the east, and the voice and the feet were simply gone. The way a held breath is finally let out. It came every night after that, dusk to dawn. Without fail, the counting circled the house. I stopped sleeping in any way that mattered. I'd lie there and follow it around the walls, in the dark. 1, 2, 3, 4, and I noticed the thing that would eventually undo me, though it took me the better part of 2 weeks to understand what it meant. The counting always stopped at 10. Every round, it would count from 1 up to 10 as it circled, and then, having reached 10 somewhere around the back corner of the house, it would fall silent. A long silence, a held pause. The feet gone still, and then it would start over. 1, 2, 3, from the beginning, 10, and then back to 1 all night long, over and over, never once going higher than 10. And I lay there one night, deep into the second week, doing the arithmetic that my frightened mind had been avoiding, and the cold of it went through me slow. 10. It counted to 10, but there were 11 windows in the house. 11. I had counted them myself that first afternoon. 4 front, and the sides, and the back, and the little boarded over one down in the cellar dark. 11 windows, and the thing outside could only find 10. It wasn't counting windows for the sake of counting. It was counting the ways in. Every night it walked the house and tallied up the ways a thing might get inside. And every night it came up one short, because there was one it couldn't reach and couldn't see. The small cellar window at the back, sealed over with my great-uncle's planks, hidden below the reach of its counting eyes. My great-uncle had boarded that window and lived 30 years in that house, and died in his bed of natural causes, an old man, in his sleep. He'd kept the count at 10, and I understood, lying there, that he hadn't boarded that window against the draft at all. He'd boarded it to keep the number wrong, to keep the thing outside from ever finding the 11th way in. I should have left it. I know that now, the way you know, a thing that's been paid for in full. But I have never in my life been able to leave a thing alone that I didn't understand, and the not knowing had gotten worse than the fear. I had to see. I had to know if the boards were still sound, if the seal still held, if the thing down there in the arithmetic was really what my crawling skin was telling me it was. So one afternoon, in the good safe daylight, I took a pry bar, and I went down the cellar stairs into that low stone dark. And I found the little boarded window at the back, where the foundation met the earth, and I set the bar under the first plank. And I want to tell you I hesitated, but the truth is, I didn't hesitate near long enough. I pulled the boards off. I told myself I only meant to look, to check the glass, and then to nail them right back up. I got the 2 planks free and I set them aside, and I bent to look at the small dark pane, and behind me, up above, up through the whole house, and out into the dusk that had come on faster than I'd meant to let it. The counting stopped. It stopped mid-number. It had been out there somewhere on its round, and it stopped, dead, in the middle of the count. And the silence that dropped over that house was the loudest thing I have ever heard in my life. I stood frozen in the cellar dark with the boards in my hand, and then a voice spoke. Not from outside. From down there in the cellar with me, from somewhere in the black past the reach of the one bare bulb. Close and low and wet, a voice thick with something like water or earth, and it did not start over at 1. It picked up right where the thing outside had left off. It said 11. It said the number the house had never let it reach, the number I had just handed it, and it said it with a terrible quiet satisfaction. 11, as though a sum 30 years unfinished had at last come out even. I ran, I dropped the boards, and I hit those cellar stairs, and I went up them faster than I have ever moved, and behind me and below me, I heard it come off the cellar floor and start to climb the stairs after me, unhurried, patient, the way it had always been patient, and as it climbed, it kept counting. But it wasn't counting windows anymore. It was counting me. It counted my steps as I fled up the stairs, one number for each footfall of mine on the boards. 1, 2, 3, keeping the tally, matching me stride for stride through the dark house, and every number was closer and lower and wetter than the last. I went out the front door into the last gray light, and I didn't stop for the truck keys, didn't stop for anything, just ran down that dirt lane through the green-gone gray tunnel of trees, with my heart tearing itself apart, and the whole way I could hear it behind me in the house, and then out of the house, and then on the lane, counting my footsteps, 4, 5, 6, patient and even, never tiring, the way it had never tired in all those nights of circling. I made the county road, and I flagged a truck, and the man took me down to town, and I never went back. I let the lawyers sort the house out, and I did not ask what became of it. But here is what I can't put down, what keeps me up on the nights when I ought to be sleeping. I got away. I don't know how, but I outran it, or it let me go, or the dawn came in time, and I've been a lot of miles and a lot of years from that mountain since. But it never finished. It counts, you understand. That's all it does. That's all it is. It counts. And it had started counting me, and it never got to stop. And some nights, when the house is quiet, and I'm lying in the dark far from any mountain, I'll be drifting off, and I'll hear it, low and patient, and far away, picking up the tally right where it left off the night I ran. 19,000 and some, it's up to now. It counts my steps still, all of them, every one I take, slow and even, and never tiring, and it is only ever getting closer, and I have known for a long time now, that it does not matter how far or how fast a man runs, from a thing that has already learned to count him. It has all the numbers there are, and sooner or later, every count comes out even. I bought the cabin for the view, which is a bitter thing to think about now. It sat on a bench of land, partway up the mountain, and the whole west wall of the living room was one great picture window that looked out over the valley, put in by some previous owner, with more money than the place otherwise showed. In the daytime, it was everything I'd wanted when I left the city. The ridgelines going blue, and then bluer into the distance. The hawks turning in the thermals, the light changing hour by hour, so the same valley was a dozen different valleys before dark. I'd sit in my chair by that window, with a book and a drink and feel, for the first time in a long while, that I'd made a right decision about something. I'd spent 40 years making wrong ones. The cabin felt like the correction. It was the nights I had to learn. Up there, when the sun dropped behind the far ridge, the dark came on complete. No streetlights, no glow from any town. Nothing but the black bulk of the mountains, and a sky full of more stars than I'd known existed, and that great picture window, which by day showed me the valley, by night showed me only myself. You know the effect I mean. Any lit room against an outer dark turns its windows to mirrors, and that big pane threw my whole living room back at me. My chair, my lamp, my book, my own self sitting there, all of it reversed, and hanging out there in the void beyond the glass, like a second room floating in the night. It ought to have unsettled me. A man's double sitting out in the dark, but it didn't, not at first. It was almost company. I lived alone, and I'd meant to live alone. But there's a loneliness that creeps into a man in a quiet cabin at night, and that reflected room with the reflected man in it was, in some strange way, a comfort. Somebody else in the house. Somebody keeping the same hours, reading the same book, lifting his glass when I lifted mine. I got used to him. I'd even, on the bad nights, talk out loud a little, knowing he sat right there. It was late autumn when it started, when the dark comes early and stays long. I was in my chair reading, and I glanced up at the window the idle way you do, and I caught my reflection turning its head. Just slightly. Just a small turn, as if the reflected man had looked from the window over toward the reflected door across the room, and I hadn't moved my head at all. I was looking straight at the glass. I went cold all over, and I froze. And in the instant I froze, so did he, snapped right back into place, mirroring me perfect. A still man in a chair, looking at a still man in a chair. I sat there with my heart going, and I told myself what a reasonable man tells himself. My eyes were tired. I'd been reading in bad light. The turn I thought I'd seen was a trick of a heavy eyelid and a dim lamp. I'd imagined the lag. And I mostly believed it, the way you mostly believe the thing you need to. But it kept on. Little wrongnesses, night after night, so small that any one of them alone I could have laughed off, but together they built into something I couldn't. My reflection would blink a half second after I did, so I'd feel my own eyes close and open, and then see his do the same, a beat behind like an echo. Or I'd look down at my book, down at the page, and lift my eyes again and catch him with his eyes still on me, still watching, only sliding back down to his own book the instant our gazes met. Small delays, small independences. A reflection is supposed to be nothing, is supposed to be pure obedient light with no will of its own, and mine had begun, ever so slightly, to lag behind my will, as though there were the smallest gap now between what I did and what it chose to do. So I started testing it, and I think that was my mistake, because a thing that's learning you does better the more you give it to learn from. I'd sit very still, and then throw my left hand up all at once, fast as I could, and watch. And the reflection would come up after me, a beat late, hitching, like a man trying to match a movement he hadn't seen coming, catching up a half second behind. I did it a dozen ways. Quick gestures, sudden turns, unexpected little motions. And every time there was that lag, that struggle to keep up, and something in the quality of it. This is the part that iced my blood. Something in it felt like study. Like there was something out there in the reflected room watching how I moved, learning the particular ways my body did its business, practicing me, getting me down. Getting better at me, because it was getting better. The lag was shrinking. By that point in the autumn, it could match a sudden movement almost cleanly, where a week before it had lurched to catch up. It was learning, and I was the lesson, and every test I ran was another hour of me teaching it how to be me. The night it stopped pretending, I'll carry with me till I'm in the ground. I was in my chair, and I raised my hand, just to test it again, just to see the lag, the way I'd done 100 times. And the reflection didn't raise its hand. It didn't move at all. I sat there in my chair with my arm up in the air, and out in the black glass, the reflected man sat in his chair with his arm down in his lap, looking at me, and he smiled. My own face out there in the dark smiled at me, wide and slow, a smile I have never once made in a mirror. And it kept sitting perfectly still, with its hand in its lap, while I sat there, with my arm raised, and my whole heart coming to pieces in my chest. The pretense was over. It had spent all that autumn learning to move like me only, so that it wouldn't have to anymore, and now it simply didn't. After that it stopped mirroring me at all, and it went about its own life in that reflected room. I'd sit in my chair, afraid to look and unable not to, and out there in the glass, the other man would be up and pacing, walking the length of the reflected living room and back, restless, while I sat frozen in mine. Sometimes he'd stand at the reflected door, the door that in my real room led to the hall and the bedrooms, and he'd look at it and turn the reflected knob, and I'd hear, in my real cabin, the small sound of my own hallway door, easing in its frame, though no hand of mine had touched it. And sometimes, worst of all, he'd come close. He'd walk right up to the inside of that black glass and press his face against it from his side, his hands flat against the pane, and look out at me. Not the way you look at your reflection. The way you look at a thing on the other side of a window. As if I were the one out in the dark, and he were the one safe and warm in the lit room, and he was studying the poor trapped creature beyond his glass with a patient, hungry, proprietary interest. The way you'd study something you meant one day to let in or let out. I mentioned it, finally, careful and shamed, to one of the old-timers in the little store down the mountain, a woman who'd lived up on that ridge her whole long life. I didn't tell her the whole of it. I just asked, roundabout, about mirrors and windows and nighttime. And she gave me a sharp look and told me plain that folks who'd been raised right up on that mountain never hung a mirror where it could face a window and never sat in a lit room at night with the curtains open on black glass. She wouldn't say much more than that, just that the dark up here was old, and it was lonesome, and it had ways of getting a look at you, and that a man who let it look long enough taught it more than he ought. And she told me the only thing that had ever helped, which was to take the black glass away, to not give it a window to be a mirror in. So I did. I went home and I bought cans of flat black paint, and I painted that whole great picture window over, floor to ceiling, edge to edge, until there was no glass left to throw the room back at me, until the west wall was just a wall of dead black paint, and the reflected room, and the reflected man had nowhere left to stand. And for a few nights it worked. The living room felt like a tomb with that painted-over window. But it was empty. There was no one in it but me. And I slept a little, and I let myself begin to believe I'd shut the door on it. But last night I got up in the small hours to use the bathroom, and I stood at the sink, and I hadn't quite come awake. And I glanced up at the mirror over the basin the way you do, and my face in the bathroom mirror was smiling, wide and slow, the same wide, slow smile. While I stood there not smiling at all, my own mouth slack with sleep and horror. And I understood the thing the old woman had been too kind or too frightened to tell me straight. It was never about the picture window. It was never about that one big pane of glass. The glass was only where I first happened to notice it. The thing had learned me in that window, spent a whole autumn getting me down, and now that it had me, it didn't need that window anymore than a man needs one particular door to leave a house that has many. It's in the bathroom mirror now. It's in the dark glass of the microwave, in the black television screen, in the still water of a full sink, in the window of the car when I drive down the mountain at night. Anywhere the light and the dark meet to make a mirror, it's there, wearing my face, waiting for me to look, getting a little better each time at the one thing been practicing all along, which is not how to move like me, but how to be me. So well and so completely that some morning soon I'll look up into the glass and there'll be nothing wrong with the reflection at all. Because by then, it'll be the one standing at the sink, and I'll be the one out in the dark, looking in. I bought the cabin for the view, which is a bitter thing to think about now. It sat on a bench of land, partway up the mountain, and the whole west wall of the living room was one great picture window that looked out over the valley, put in by some previous owner, with more money than the place otherwise showed. In the daytime, it was everything I'd wanted when I left the city. The ridgelines going blue, and then bluer into the distance. The hawks turning in the thermals, the light changing hour by hour, so the same valley was a dozen different valleys before dark. I'd sit in my chair by that window, with a book and a drink and feel, for the first time in a long while, that I'd made a right decision about something. I'd spent 40 years making wrong ones. The cabin felt like the correction. It was the nights I had to learn. Up there, when the sun dropped behind the far ridge, the dark came on complete. No streetlights, no glow from any town. Nothing but the black bulk of the mountains, and a sky full of more stars than I'd known existed. And that great picture window, which by day showed me the valley, by night showed me only myself. You know the effect I mean. Any lit room against an outer dark turns its windows to mirrors, and that big pane threw my whole living room back at me. My chair, my lamp, my book, my own self sitting there, all of it reversed, and hanging out there in the void beyond the glass, like a second room floating in the night. It ought to have unsettled me. A man's double sitting out in the dark. But it didn't, not at first. It was almost company. I lived alone, and I'd meant to live alone. But there's a loneliness that creeps into a man in a quiet cabin at night, and that reflected room with the reflected man in it was, in some strange way, a comfort. Somebody else in the house. Somebody keeping the same hours, reading the same book, lifting his glass when I lifted mine. I got used to him. I'd even, on the bad nights, talk out loud a little, knowing he sat right there. It was late autumn when it started, when the dark comes early and stays long. I was in my chair reading, and I glanced up at the window the idle way you do, and I caught my reflection turning its head, just slightly. Just a small turn, as if the reflected man had looked from the window over toward the reflected door across the room, and I hadn't moved my head at all. I was looking straight at the glass. I went cold all over, and I froze. And in the instant I froze, so did he, snapped right back into place, mirroring me perfect. A still man in a chair, looking at a still man in a chair. I sat there with my heart going, and I told myself what a reasonable man tells himself. My eyes were tired. I'd been reading in bad light. The turn I thought I'd seen was a trick of a heavy eyelid and a dim lamp. I'd imagined the lag. And I mostly believed it, the way you mostly believe the thing you need to. But it kept on. Little wrongnesses, night after night, so small that any one of them alone I could have laughed off, but together they built into something I couldn't. My reflection would blink a half second after I did, so I'd feel my own eyes close and open, and then see his do the same, a beat behind like an echo. Or I'd look down at my book, down at the page, and lift my eyes again and catch him with his eyes still on me, still watching, only sliding back down to his own book the instant our gazes met. Small delays, small independences. A reflection is supposed to be nothing, is supposed to be pure obedient light with no will of its own. And mine had begun, ever so slightly, to lag behind my will, as though there were the smallest gap now between what I did and what it chose to do. So I started testing it, and I think that was my mistake, because a thing that's learning you does better the more you give it to learn from. I'd sit very still, and then throw my left hand up all at once, fast as I could, and watch. And the reflection would come up after me, a beat late, hitching, like a man trying to match a movement he hadn't seen coming, catching up a half second behind. I did it a dozen ways. Quick gestures, sudden turns, unexpected little motions. And every time there was that lag, that struggle to keep up, and something in the quality of it. This is the part that iced my blood. Something in it felt like study. Like there was something out there in the reflected room watching how I moved, learning the particular ways my body did its business, practicing me, getting me down. Getting better at me, because it was getting better. The lag was shrinking. By that point in the autumn, it could match a sudden movement almost cleanly, where a week before it had lurched to catch up. It was learning, and I was the lesson, and every test I ran was another hour of me teaching it how to be me. The night it stopped pretending, I'll carry with me till I'm in the ground. I was in my chair, and I raised my hand, just to test it again, just to see the lag, the way I'd done 100 times, and the reflection didn't raise its hand. It didn't move at all. I sat there in my chair with my arm up in the air, and out in the black glass, the reflected man sat in his chair with his arm down in his lap, looking at me, and he smiled. My own face out there in the dark smiled at me, wide and slow, a smile I have never once made in a mirror. And it kept sitting perfectly still, with its hand in its lap, while I sat there with my arm raised, and my whole heart coming to pieces in my chest. The pretense was over. It had spent all that autumn learning to move like me only, so that it wouldn't have to anymore, and now it simply didn't. After that it stopped mirroring me at all, and it went about its own life in that reflected room. I'd sit in my chair, afraid to look and unable not to, and out there in the glass, the other man would be up and pacing, walking the length of the reflected living room and back, restless, while I sat frozen in mine. Sometimes he'd stand at the reflected door, the door that in my real room led to the hall and the bedrooms, and he'd look at it and turn the reflected knob, and I'd hear, in my real cabin, the small sound of my own hallway door, easing in its frame, though no hand of mine had touched it. And sometimes, worst of all, he'd come close. He'd walk right up to the inside of that black glass and press his face against it from his side, his hands flat against the pane, and look out at me. Not the way you look at your reflection, the way you look at a thing on the other side of a window. As if I were the one out in the dark, and he were the one safe and warm in the lit room, and he was studying the poor trapped creature beyond his glass with a patient, hungry, proprietary interest, the way you'd study something you meant one day to let in or let out. I mentioned it, finally, careful and shamed, to one of the old-timers in the little store down the mountain, a woman who'd lived up on that ridge her whole long life. I didn't tell her the whole of it. I just asked, roundabout, about mirrors and windows and nighttime. And she gave me a sharp look and told me plain that folks who'd been raised right up on that mountain never hung a mirror where it could face a window, and never sat in a lit room at night with the curtains open on black glass. She wouldn't say much more than that, just that the dark up here was old, and it was lonesome, and it had ways of getting a look at you, and that a man who let it look long enough taught it more than he ought. And she told me the only thing that had ever helped, which was to take the black glass away, to not give it a window to be a mirror in. So I did. I went home and I bought cans of flat black paint, and I painted that whole great picture window over, floor to ceiling, edge to edge, until there was no glass left to throw the room back at me, until the west wall was just a wall of dead black paint, and the reflected room, and the reflected man had nowhere left to stand. And for a few nights it worked. The living room felt like a tomb with that painted-over window. But it was empty. There was no one in it but me. And I slept a little, and I let myself begin to believe I'd shut the door on it. But last night I got up in the small hours to use the bathroom, and I stood at the sink, and I hadn't quite come awake. And I glanced up at the mirror over the basin the way you do, and my face in the bathroom mirror was smiling, wide and slow, the same wide, slow smile. While I stood there not smiling at all, my own mouth slack with sleep and horror. And I understood the thing the old woman had been too kind or too frightened to tell me straight. It was never about the picture window. It was never about that one big pane of glass. The glass was only where I first happened to notice it. The thing had learned me in that window, spent a whole autumn getting me down, and now that it had me, it didn't need that window anymore than a man needs one particular door to leave a house that has many. It's in the bathroom mirror now. It's in the dark glass of the microwave, in the black television screen, in the still water of a full sink, in the window of the car when I drive down the mountain at night. Anywhere the light and the dark meet to make a mirror, it's there, wearing my face, waiting for me to look, getting a little better each time at the one thing been practicing all along, which is not how to move like me, but how to be me. So well and so completely that some morning soon I'll look up into the glass and there'll be nothing wrong with the reflection at all. Because by then, it'll be the one standing at the sink, and I'll be the one out in the dark, looking in.
The ice storm came down on the mountain the way those storms always do up there, without much warning and with no mercy at all. I'd been in the cabin near a year by then, long enough to think I understood mountain winters, and I did understand the snow, which comes soft and deep and quiet, but ice is a different animal. Ice comes as rain that freezes the instant it touches anything, and it built up over 3 days into a world made of glass. Every branch, every wire, every blade of dead grass sheathed in it. The whole holler glazed and groaning, the trees cracking off in the night like rifle shots as the weight got to be too much for them. The power went out the first evening and didn't come back. I had a wood stove and a good stack of split oak and a couple of oil lamps, so I wasn't afraid, not at first. I settled in to wait it out the way you do. One man alone in a warm little box of light in the middle of a frozen dark that stretched for miles in every direction with not another living soul in it. It was the third night of the storm that he came. I was sitting close by the stove, and over the steady tick and hiss of the ice against the windows, I heard something else, a small sound, a tapping, and then a voice, a child's voice. I got up with the lamp and went toward the front window, and there on the other side of the glass, standing on my porch in the killing cold, was a little boy. He couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old. He had on a thin shirt, just a thin cotton shirt, with no coat, and his hair was frozen stiff, and his lips had gone a deep blue, and he was shivering all over. His small hands pressed flat against the glass, and he was looking at me with big wet eyes and saying, "Soft as anything, please, mister. Please let me in. It's so cold, please." And every good and human instinct I had came up in me at once and screamed to throw that door open and pull that freezing child inside to the fire. Because what kind of a man leaves a little boy to die in an ice storm? What kind of a monster stands on the warm side of the glass and does nothing? But I didn't open the door. And I have gone over and over in my mind what it was that held me. Because in the moment, I couldn't have named it, only felt it. A deep cold wrongness that had nothing to do with the weather. Part of it was the plain impossibility of him. There was no house within 4 miles. No road a child could have walked in that ice. No car in my drive but my own. No tracks in the frozen crust of the porch snow leading up to where he stood. But it was more than that, and I finally put my finger on the worst of it, as I stood there frozen myself, the lamp shaking a little in my hand, his breath. It was well below freezing out there, cold enough that my own breath fogged the inside of the glass just from standing near it. But the boy pressed right up against the outside of the pane, mouth moving, pleading. Breathing, his breath didn't fog the glass at all. Not a wisp, not a trace. A living child in that cold would have left the whole pane clouded with the warmth coming out of him. This one left the glass clear and cold and dry, as though whatever was moving that small mouth had no warmth in it anywhere, had never had any, was only shaped like a thing that breathed. I found my voice and I told him to wait. Just wait right there, that I was going to call for help. And I backed away from the window to where my phone sat. The cell signal up in that holler was poor at the best of times, but the county line still had an old landline that worked when the cell didn't, and by some grace it was working that night. A woman answered, the county dispatcher, and I started trying to tell her there was a child at my window, a little boy, freezing, and I need somebody to come, and even as I said it, I heard how it fell apart. A child alone in an ice storm 4 miles from anywhere, and while I was talking, I looked back toward the front window, and the boy wasn't there anymore. He was at the side window now, the one over by the kitchen, his palms flat against that glass. That same soft voice coming through it, "Please, I'm so cold, let me in." And I hadn't heard him move, and no child could have crossed that ice-glazed porch and come around the corner of the house in the few seconds my back had been turned. Not on that slick killing ground, not without me hearing his feet break the crust. I said as much into the phone, my voice climbing, "He's at another window now. He moved. He shouldn't have been able to move that fast. And the dispatcher went quiet for a second, and when she spoke again, her voice had changed. It had gone tight and careful and low, the voice of somebody choosing her words, and she said, "Listen to me, lock every door and every window latch you've got, and do not go near the glass, and do not open anything, no matter what you see out there, no matter what it says to you." And the way she said it, flat and certain and afraid, told me plain that she had taken this call before, that mine was not the first voice to come down that line on a hard winter night talking about a child at the window. I asked her what it was. I asked her straight out. And she was quiet a moment, and then she told me that folks up in my holler had lost people to a bad winter, a long time back, a whole hard season where the cold took more than its share, children among them, and that the ground up there froze so deep and stayed froze so long that the mountain didn't always let its winter dead lie quiet the way dead ought to lie. She said, the cold sent them back sometimes, in the worst storms, wearing the shapes that would work best on whoever was inside, wearing pity like a lure, because pity was the one thing that would make a warm living person open a locked door to the killing dark. "Don't you give it your pity," she said. And then the line crackled and went dead, the ice finally bringing the county wire down somewhere out in the dark, and I was alone, and he begged. All night long he begged. He went around and around the house, window to window, faster and faster. Always that soft, small voice, "Please, it's so cold. Please let me in. I'm so cold, mister. Please." I went around after him with the lamp, checking each latch, and everywhere I went he was already there or came a moment later, his handprints on the glass, his blue face pressed close, those wet frozen eyes finding mine through the pane. I sat in the middle of the front room, finally where I couldn't be close to any one window, and I put my hands over my ears, and still the voice came, from every side of the house in turn, patient, endless, "Please, please, let me in," and toward the dead middle of the night, when the cold outside was at its worst, and the fire had burned low, and I was more frightened and more alone than I have ever been in my life, the voice began to change. It happened so slow I almost didn't catch it. The little boy's softness started to wear thin, like paint scraping off something underneath, and the voice behind it began to come through, deeper, older, a grown thing's voice, patient in a way no child is ever patient, still saying the same words, "Please, it's so cold, let me in," but no longer bothering toward the end to sound young at all. The pretense was simply too much trouble to keep up as the night wore on, and the thing at my windows let it slip, and what was left underneath was the true thing, old and cold and tireless, still pressing its shape to my glass, still asking to be let in, only now in a voice that made the marrow go to water in my bones. I did not answer it. I did not go to the glass. I sat by my dying fire, and I did not give it one word or one look or 1 ounce of the pity it had come for, and I waited for the sun the way a drowning man waits for air. When the gray light finally came up over the far ridge, the voice stopped, all at once, midward, the way it had at the county line. I sat there a long while not trusting it, and then, when the light had come up full and honest, and the frozen world outside had gone still and empty, I got up on legs that barely held me, and I went to look. The porch was empty. The snow crust was unbroken, not one track in it, not one mark of any small foot, nothing to say a living child had ever stood there at all. I went around the house looking, half mad with relief, telling myself it was over, that I'd held out, that I'd been smart enough not to open the door. And then I came to the kitchen window, and on the inside of the glass, the inside, the side I stood on, the warm side, my side, there were handprints, small ones, child-sized, pressed into the faint fog my own breath had left on the cold pane, 5 little fingers, and a small palm, several of them, on the inside of a window I had never once opened. On a pane no small living hand had touched from within, because there had been no child inside that house, but the man who stood there now shaking, looking at them. I don't know when it got in. I have turned that night over 10,000 times, and I cannot find the moment. I never opened a door. I never unlatched a window. I never once answered it, or looked it in the eye, or gave it the pity it kept asking for. I did everything the dispatcher told me, and everything my own fear told me, and still somehow, at some point in that long dark, those small cold hands were on the inside of my glass, pressing out toward the dawn, as if it were the one wanting now to leave, or as if it had never really needed my permission at all, and the asking, the whole long night of pleading, the freezing child, and the blue lips, and the soft, "Please let me in." Maybe none of that was ever the door it meant to come through. Maybe that was just to keep me busy, keep me listening, keep me sitting in the middle of my little box of light with my hands over my ears. While the real cold, the patient old cold that the mountain never quite lets lie, came in some other way entirely, quiet through the man himself, through the pity he was so sure he'd kept locked up tight. I left that holler at the first thaw, and I have never gone back to any high cold place since. But I'll tell you, some winters, when it gets down bitter and the wind comes hard against the windows in the dark, I catch myself listening for a small voice. And worse than that, God help me, I catch myself, just for a moment, wanting to hear it.
I went up to that cabin to be alone, and for a while, I got exactly what I'd asked for, which is a lesson a man ought to learn earlier than I did. It was a small place high on the side of a mountain, looking out across a wide, deep valley toward the far ridge on the other side, miles off across a gulf of dark forest that filled the bottom of the valley like water fills a bowl. There was no town in sight, no road you could see from the windows, no other house, nothing but the folded blue mountains going away in every direction. In the daytime, it was the most beautiful and the most empty place I'd ever been. But it was the nights up there that got into me. Because when the sun went down behind the ridges, the dark that came was absolute. A dark with no bottom to it, and a man alone in a small cabin in the middle of that. Much nothing starts to feel just how small and how alone he really is. Except I wasn't quite alone, or so it seemed those first weeks, because there was the light. From my bedroom window, looking out across the black valley toward the far ridge, I could see one single point of light in all that darkness. A small, warm yellow square, the unmistakable glow of a lamplit window in another cabin, way out there on the opposite ridge, miles off across the void. Another house, another soul. Somebody else up in these lonesome mountains, keeping a light on against the same dark I was keeping mine against. I can't tell you how much comfort that little yellow square gave me those first lonely weeks. I'd lie in bed and look at it before I slept, and feel a kind of kinship with whoever was out there, some other hermit, some other person who'd wanted to get away from the world and had come up here to do it. Some nights, feeling foolish and not caring, I'd even lift my hand and wave at it across the dark. One lonely fool saluting another, and then I'd turn off my lamp and go to sleep a little less alone than I'd have been without it. It was somewhere in the third or fourth week that I first noticed the thing that would come to unmake me. I turned off my bedroom lamp one night, and in the same moment, out across the valley, the far light went dark too. I didn't think much of it. Late hour, both of us turning in, natural enough. But I lay there in the dark a minute, and then, for no reason, reached over and clicked my lamp back on, and across the valley, in the same breath, the yellow square came back. On when mine was on, off when mine was off. I told myself it was chance, two tired men keeping the same country hours, and I turned my light off and went to sleep. But it nagged at me, and a few nights later I tested it, not really believing anything would come of it, half laughing at myself even as I did it. I flicked my lamp off and on in a little pattern, off, on, off, on, and I watched the far light. And across all those miles of black forest, that distant yellow square flicked off and on in the very same pattern. Exactly, in perfect time. Not a beat behind, the way a man watching and copying would have to be, but with me, matched to me, as though the same hand worked both switches. My skin went cold all over, sitting there in my bed with my hand on the lamp. I told myself there had to be a reason. Maybe some trick of reflection, my own light bouncing off something across the valley. Maybe another person out there who happened, by wild chance, to be flicking their lamp at the same moments. I ran through every explanation a reasonable man runs through, when he's trying not to believe what he's already seen. and none of them held, and under all of them was that cold, certain, knowing that the far light was not another cabin at all, was not another lonely soul, was something that had been watching my window every night since I came, learning when I turned my light on and off, learning my rhythm, and had begun, now, to show me that it knew. In the daylight, of course, it all seemed like the raving of a man who'd been alone too long, and I resolved to settle it the sensible way. There was an old logging road that ran down off my ridge and around the head of the valley, and up the other side, toward where that far light burned every night. It took me most of a morning to drive it, the road half grown over and washed out in places. But I made it up onto the far ridge, to the spot where, by every reckoning I could make, the other cabin had to stand. And there was no cabin. There was no cleared lot, no driveway, no mailbox, no sign that anyone had lived up there in my lifetime. What there was, back in a tangle of laurel, so thick I nearly walked past it, was a foundation. An old stone foundation, burned out, black with a fire decades gone. The laurel and the saplings grown up, right through the middle of where the floor had been. And one thing still standing above the ruin. The chimney, a tall field stone chimney, rising up out of the green like a gravestone. The only piece of that house, the fire, and the 50 years hadn't taken down. I stood there in that quiet ruined place a long time. There was no window up here for a light to shine from. There hadn't been a window, or a wall to hold one, or a soul to light a lamp, in half a century. And every single night for a month I had lain in my bed and watched a warm yellow window glow from this exact spot, and waved at it like a friend. I drove back around that valley with my hands cold on the wheel, telling myself I'd leave, I'd pack that night and go. And I mean to tell you I might have, except that some stubborn broken part of me had to see it one more time, had to look across the dark and know. So that night I sat in my dark bedroom with my lamp off, and I watched the far ridge, and the light came on. Right there where the burned chimney stood, where nothing living was, that warm yellow square bloomed up out of the black, patient, steady, waiting. Waiting for me. Waiting, I understood, for me to answer it, to turn my lamp on the way I always had, to give it the rhythm it fed on. And I didn't. Whatever cold sense was left in me told me not to, and I sat there in the pitch dark, and I would not turn on my light. And when I wouldn't answer, the light began to move. I have to make you understand what that was like, because it is the thing I see when I close my eyes now. That yellow square, that lonely warm window glow that had comforted me for weeks, lifted up off the far ridge where the dead chimney stood, and it began to drift. Slow, so slow. It came down off the far ridge and out over the black gulf of the valley, floating, sinking down toward the sea of dark treetops, a single square of lamplit window with no house around it, no wall, no roof, nothing but the light itself hanging in the dark, moving toward me. It came so slowly that if I looked away and looked back, it seemed not to have moved at all. And yet over the hours of that night, it crossed a measurable distance, down into the valley, in among the trees, and I watched it come, and I could not move, and I could not look away. It was coming to find me, the only other lit soul in all that dark, and I'd stopped being lit, and it was coming across the whole valley to find out why, to find me, to be near the one warm window left. I lasted till dawn, and the light faded with the coming gray, but it did not go back. It stopped where the morning caught it, down in the trees at the bottom of the valley, and hung there faint and waiting for the dark to come again. And the next night it started forward once more, up out of the valley now, onto the lower slope of my own ridge, closer, that patient yellow square, drifting up through the black woods toward my cabin, one slow dark hour at a time. I could not run in the night, not down that washed-out road in the dark, with that thing between me and the way out. And in the daytime, God help me, I could not make myself leave, because in the daytime the light was gone, and the fear went thin, and some part of me still could not fully believe. So I did the only thing I could think to do. I stopped lighting my lamp. I sat in my cabin in total darkness every night. No lamp, no candle, no glow of any kind, giving it nothing. No rhythm to read, no lit window to home in on, hoping that if I stayed dark long enough, it would lose me, would drift on past, would go looking for some other light, somewhere else in the mountains. But here is the thing I have come to understand, sitting in the black these long nights. The dark is not empty of rhythm. A man alone in the pitch dark still has a rhythm, his breathing, the beat of his heart, the small sounds he can't help making, the warmth coming off his body into the cold air, the pattern of when he sleeps and when he wakes and when he stirs. I took away the light, but I couldn't take away myself, and I have begun, these last few nights, to feel that it is learning the new rhythm the way it learned the old one. I sit in the dark, and I hold my breath and try to be still and give it nothing, and out beyond my black window, close now, so close, just down the slope in the trees, that yellow square hangs and waits, and I have the growing certain sense that it is timing itself to my heartbeat now, matching the rise and fall of my chest, drifting a few feet closer each time I can't help but breathe. It's nearly to the yard. I don't turn on any light. I sit in the dark and I try to make no rhythm at all, try to be as still and cold and empty as the dead chimney it came from. But a living man can't be empty, not all the way, not for long. And I think the last thing it needs to learn, the last rhythm it's waiting on, is the one I can't stop giving it, and won't be able to give it much longer, which is the rhythm of a man still alive in the dark, still afraid, still here. We moved up onto that mountain to save our marriage, which I've come to think is about the worst reason there is to move anywhere, let alone to a place that far from other people. Things had gotten thin between my wife and me down in the world, worn down by jobs and money, and the slow accumulation of small grievances that a marriage collects like a gutter collects leaves, and we'd gotten it into our heads that what we needed was to strip everything away, get back to just the two of us, somewhere quiet, somewhere we'd have nothing to do but be together, and remember why we'd started. So we bought the cabin. It sat at the end of 4 miles of dirt road, on a shoulder of the mountain, with no neighbors in sight, the nearest being an old woman, whose place was a good way down the slope, and for the first little while it seemed to be working. We cooked together, we sat on the porch, we talked more than we had in years, and then the mountain started to give us what it gives people who go looking for solitude, which is more of it than any human soul was ever built to hold. It was my wife who saw them first. We'd been up there maybe a month when she started acting strange in the evenings, going quiet, keeping her eyes off the windows once it got dark. One night she told me, in a small, careful voice, like she was afraid of how it would sound, that there was someone in the yard, someone who copied her. She said that morning, standing at the kitchen window with her coffee, she'd seen a figure out past the edge of the yard, standing in the tree line, and that when she'd stirred her coffee, the figure had stirred something too, the same slow circle of the arm. And when she'd lifted the mug to her lips, it had lifted something to it. And when she'd brushed her hair back from her face, it had made the same motion, every gesture she made, given back to her through the glass by that shape in the dark. I did what a husband does. I told her it was the isolation, the fatigue, that we'd cut ourselves off so far from everyone, that our minds were filling the emptiness with things, that she was tired and lonely and seeing patterns in the trees. I believed it too. I wanted to. Then I saw them myself, and there wasn't one. There were several. It was full dark, and I'd stepped out onto the porch with a mug of coffee to look at the stars the way I'd gotten in the habit of doing, and out past the reach of the porch light, out at the ragged edge where the light gave up and the dark woods began. There was a loose row of figures, standing, man-shaped still, watching the house. I froze with the mug halfway to my mouth, and as I did, out in the dark, they all raised something halfway to where their mouths would be. I stood there not breathing. I scratched my jaw, slow, testing, hardly believing I was doing it, and out in the dark, the whole row of them scratched. A ragged motion, not quite together, some of them a beat behind, some of them getting the gesture too big or too small, but scratching, all of them at the same side of the same jaw. A whole silent audience of them, standing out there in the dark aping me. Not for sport. That was the thing I felt in my gut even then, before I understood it in my head. There was nothing playful in it. It was too intent, too studious, too patient. They were working at it. They were practicing. I didn't sleep that night, and after that neither of us could pretend anymore. So we watched them together, which I think now was our mistake, 'cause the watching was what fed it. Every night they were there, the loose row of them, beyond the porch light, and every night they copied us, and every night they got better at it. That's the part that turns my stomach still. At first, they were clumsy, like people learning a dance from watching through a window, half a beat behind, the movements exaggerated or too slight, the timing off. But they learned. Night by night, the lag closed. The gestures got truer. By the end of the first week, they could match a movement, almost as I made it. The raised mug, the turned head, the shift of weight from foot to foot, given back to me clean and quick, out of the dark. By the second week, there was no lag at all. They moved exactly as we moved, exactly when we moved, so that raising my hand felt less like being copied, and more like looking into a dark and crowded mirror. A dozen of me and a dozen of her, out there in the black, doing everything we did in the same instant we did it. And I understood, cold all the way through, that they had never been watching us to mock us. They'd been watching us to learn us, to rehearse us, to get us down so exactly that they could, when the practicing was done, be us. It took me until then to work up the nerve, to go down the mountain and ask the old woman, our one neighbor, whether she knew anything about what lived up here in the dark. She was ancient, her place full of the smell of wood smoke and old paper, and when I started to describe it, careful, roundabout, the figures in the yard, the copying, she stopped me with a look and wouldn't meet my eyes after that. She said the ones in the dark up here had been on this mountain longer than any people had, and that they had always been poor imitations of folks, hollow things that couldn't make a life of their own, and so learned to copy the lives of others. She said, they came to the lonely places, the far cabins, the people who'd cut themselves off, because a soul with no one else to look at will look at anything, and looking is how it starts. And she told me the thing I have never been able to shake. She said the ones who watched them too long tended to change, to go quiet, to start, little by little, moving a half beat behind their own lives, like a person who's forgotten how to lead and can only follow. Get your wife off this mountain, she said, and don't you watch them anymore. And then she shut her door, and I heard the bolt go, and I drove back up to my cabin in the failing light with my heart in my throat. Because I'd already begun to notice it about my wife. She didn't stir her coffee the way she used to. There was a particular way she'd always done it. A quick double tap of the spoon on the rim when she was done. A small unconscious habit of 20 years. And it had gone out of her, replaced by a slow blank circling that wasn't hers, that I had seen, God help me, out in the yard in the dark, and she'd stopped avoiding the windows. Where before she'd kept her eyes down, afraid, now she sat and faced the glass in the evenings and watched them, calm, easy, and worse than that, she'd started answering them. I caught her one night, lifting her hand to the dark window in a small, slow wave, and out in the yard the row of figures waved back, and she smiled at them, a soft, pleased smile, and out in the dark they smiled too, and I could not for the life of me tell in that moment who had smiled first. She'd stopped being afraid. She'd started keeping company with them, and the woman who sat in my kitchen at night, watching the dark and waving at it and smiling its smile, was still my wife in every feature and every line. But she moved a half-beat wrong, a half-beat behind, like a recording of my wife, played back with the smallest lag in the world. I told myself I still had time, that I could get her off the mountain, that whatever had gotten into the rhythm of her hadn't gotten all the way in yet. I made a plan to leave. And then last night, the last of my certainty came apart. I was standing in the bathroom, tired past sense, and I caught sight of myself in the mirror over the sink, and I lifted my hand to rub my face, and my reflection lagged. Just a hair. Just the smallest half-beat behind, my hand already moving, and its hand starting a fraction of a second late, following me instead of matching me. And for one cold, endless second, watching that reflected hand come up a beat behind my own, I could not tell which of us was the one leading. I could not tell if I was the man raising his hand, and the thing in the glass was copying me, or if I had already, without noticing, become the copy, the follower, the half-beat behind thing, and the one leading was somewhere else now, somewhere out in the dark, wearing my rhythm, getting it perfect. We're leaving tomorrow. I've packed the truck already, in the dark, quiet, so as not to wake whatever's sleeping in the shape of my wife in the next room. At first light, we're driving down that mountain, and we are never coming back, and I keep telling myself it isn't too late, that we're still us, that a man and his wife can still get in a truck and drive away from a thing like this. But I lie here in the dark, and I listen to her breathing beside me, and her breath comes just slightly out of time with mine, a half-beat behind, following the rise and fall of my chest the way those figures followed my hand in the yard. And I find myself in the dark, testing it, holding my breath to see if hers holds too, moving my hand to see if hers moves. And they do, and I can't stop doing it. And the terrible thing, the thing that's kept me awake all this long last night, is that I've started to lose track, lying here, of whether I'm the one running the test, or the one being tested. Whether these are my breaths she's following, or her breaths I've begun, without knowing when it started, to follow. We're leaving tomorrow. I only pray that, when the truck pulls out at first light, it's still the two of us in it, and not the two of them, driving down off the mountain to go practice being people somewhere new. The cabin had been my grandfather's, and when it came to me, after the family finally stopped fighting over the estate, I took it as a kind of homecoming. Though I hadn't set foot in it since I was a boy, it sat up a long holler in the high country, the last house on a dead-end road, backed right up against the national forest, so that the woods came down close around it on three sides, close enough that in a wind you could hear the whole mountain moving. My grandfather had lived out his last years, up there alone, after my grandmother passed, a quiet, stubborn old man who wouldn't come down off his mountain no matter how the family begged. And he died up there alone too, in his sleep, not found for the better part of a week. I'd loved him more than just about anybody when I was small. He'd been a radio man in the war, a signals operator, and one of my clearest and warmest memories of childhood was him sitting me on his knee and teaching me Morse code, tapping the letters out on the arm of his chair, patient, making a game of it, until I could rattle off my own name in dots and dashes, and he'd laugh and call me by the pet name he had for me, a name nobody else ever used. I hadn't thought about the code in 30 years when I moved back into his cabin. But some things, it turns out, don't leave you. They just wait. The tapping started about 2 weeks in. It came at the bedroom window, the one at the back of the house facing the deep woods, and it woke me a little after 3 in the morning. Just a tapping on the glass. 3 taps, a little pause, 5 taps, a pause, and then quiet. I lay there half asleep and thought nothing much of it. A branch in the wind, a moth or a June bug knocking against the pane, the ordinary sounds an old house in the woods makes at night. I rolled over and went back to sleep. But it came the next night too, and the night after, always around 3, always that same deliberate patterning, and it began to bother me in a way I couldn't quite name, because there was no branch near that window. I'd checked. The nearest tree was a good 15 feet off, nothing that could reach the glass even in a gale. And a bird or a bug doesn't tap in patterns, doesn't pause between clusters like it's spacing out something meant to be understood. 3 taps, pause, 5 taps, pause, over and over, in the dead middle of the night, at a window nothing living should have been able to reach. I lay awake listening to it, night after night, and slowly, the way you recognize a face in a crowd you didn't expect to see, my ear started to catch what my sleeping mind had been too dull to hear. It wasn't random. The clusters weren't just clusters, long taps and short taps, dots and dashes, spaced out with the little gaps between letters and the longer gaps between words. And once I heard it that way, I could not unhear it, could not go back to it being just noise, because it was code. It was Morse, my grandfather's game, come back to me across 30 years, tapping on the glass in the dark. And once I let myself really listen, really translate it the way he'd taught me, the letters came clear, slow and patient and deliberate. L-E-T-M-E. I sat straight up in bed with my heart slamming. My first thought, my only sane thought, was that somebody was playing a cruel and elaborate joke on me. Some local who'd known my grandfather, who knew he'd been a radio man, who thought it'd be funny to spook the city relative who'd moved into the old place. It made me angry more than afraid, and I resolved to catch them at it. But the tapping knew things a prankster couldn't know. The next night, it tapped out a string of letters and numbers that meant nothing to me. At first, until the shape of it surfaced from some deep childhood memory, and I realized it was his call sign, my grandfather's own operator's call sign from the war, a thing I'd heard him say maybe twice in my life and had certainly never told another living soul. And then, slow and gentle against the glass, it tapped the pet name, the name he had for me, the one nobody else had ever used, that I had never spoken aloud in that house or anywhere else in 30 years, that had died, I'd thought, with him. It tapped my secret childhood name on the window in the dark, in his old code, and every hair on my body stood up. I should have left then, I know that. But grief is a strange and hungry thing, and I had loved that old man, and some part of me that I couldn't govern needed to know. So one night, God forgive me, when the tapping came, I answered it. I reached out from my bed to the cold glass, and I tapped back just one small word, careful, from the safe inside of the pane. H-O. Who? And the answer came back so fast, so eager, tumbling out against the glass with a kind of joy in it, that it broke something in me, and I started to weep like a child. It spelled his name. His own first name, that I'd called him by when I was small before I learned to call him Grandpa, and then quick and glad and warm, I-M-C-O-L-D-O-U-T-H-E-R-E. I'm cold out here, And oh, how I wanted to open that window. I lay there sobbing in the dark, with my hand flat against the cold glass. And on the other side of it was my grandfather's voice, in the only language that was still his, telling me he was cold, and everything in me that had loved him and lost him, and never gotten to say goodbye, wanted to throw that sash up and let him in out of the cold. He'd died alone, not found for a week, cold, and alone in the very house I was lying in. And now here he was at my window, asking to come in from the cold, and I was going to leave him out there? I didn't open the window. I want that on the record, because it may be the only thing that saved me. Some last cold, sober piece of me held my hand still on the latch. Some instinct older than grief that knew, that understood a dead man, does not tap on your window in the night no matter how much you loved him, and I did not open it. I lay there and I wept, and I did not open it, and after a long while the tapping stopped. But it didn't leave, it moved. The next night it came from the living room window, that same patient code, working at the glass, and when I ignored it, the night after, it was at the kitchen window. It worked its way around the house night by night, window to window, and as I kept refusing to answer, kept refusing to open anything, the messages began to change. The love went out of them slow, like heat leaving a body. Where before it had been my name and his name and I'm cold, let me in, please, it began to sour. It tapped that it was lonely. It tapped that I'd forgotten it, that I didn't love it anymore, that a good grandson wouldn't leave his grandfather out in the dark and the cold. And when I still wouldn't answer, the thing behind the code seemed to grow tired of the game. And one night at the kitchen glass, it tapped out something that stopped my breath in my throat. It tapped, THISISNT, This isn't him, a pause, and then slow, almost gloating YOUKNOWTHAT, you know that. It had dropped the mask, just for a moment, just to let me feel how thoroughly it had understood me all along, how it had known from the first tap that I knew, and had used the loving words anyway, because knowing hadn't been enough to stop me wanting. The last night is the one I can't get out of me. I'd resolved to leave at dawn, had my bag packed by the door, was just trying to last out the dark. And a little after 3 it began, but not from one window, from all of them. Every window in the house at once, front and back, and both sides. A tapping from every pane, dozens of taps, more hands than a house has windows. A whole crowd of them out there in the dark, working the glass in the same code all together. And it wasn't the sour taunting from before, and it wasn't the pleading either. It was a chorus, all of them tapping the same 3 words in perfect unison, over and over, all around the house, patient and endless in the dark. And when I made my shaking hands translate it, when I let myself hear what all those hands were spelling out together against my grandfather's windows, I sank down onto the floor, because they were tapping the 3 words my grandfather never got to say to me. The 3 words he died before he could say, alone in that house that I had spent 30 years, and my whole grieving heart, wishing I could have heard him say, just once. The 3 words I would have given anything, anything at all, to hear from him. And there they were, tapping on every window in the dark, in his code, in the language that had been our own private thing, the exact words, the exact wish, offered up all at once from every side of the house. And that's how I finally understood what it was, and what it had been doing all along. It hadn't picked those words by chance. It had gone down into me, into the deepest and most tender and most wounded part of me, and found the one thing I wanted most in all the world and had been denied. And it had learned to spell it. It had used the code, because the code was the way to me. It had used his name and my name, and I'm cold out here. And when those didn't work, it went deeper and found the words themselves, the ones with the most pull, the ones no grieving grandson could hear, tapped on a window in the dark without needing to open that window and let the love in. That was the whole of it. That was all it had ever wanted, from the very first 3 taps. To find the words that would make me open the window myself. I got out at first light. I ran to the truck through the gray dawn with the tapping fading behind me. And I drove down off that mountain. And I have never gone back. And I sold the cabin sight unseen and let the new owners deal with whatever taps on the glass up there now. But I'll tell you the thing that keeps me up. I never did open that window. I held out. And I know I ought to feel nothing but relief at that. But there are nights, still, years on, when I lie awake and I think about those 3 words, tapping on every pane in my grandfather's code, the words he never got to say, the words I've wanted my whole life to hear. And God help me, some part of me is sorry I didn't open the window. Some part of me lies there in the dark and taps them out against my own bedroom glass, slow, from the inside, just to hear them one more time. And every time I do it, I hold my breath afterward in the quiet, half afraid, half hoping that something out in the dark will tap them back. This is the strangest thing that ever happened to me, and I've saved it for last because even now, after all this time, I don't have a name for it. And a thing you can't name sits differently in you than a thing you can. I've read about haunts, and I've heard the old mountain stories about the things in the woods, and none of them fit what came to me that winter in that cabin. All I can do is tell it plain and let it be as strange to you as it still is to me. The cabin sat high up a mountain in a place where the winters come early and stay long, snowed in for weeks at a stretch sometimes. The road down impassable, no way out but to wait for a thaw. I'd wanted exactly that kind of solitude and I'd gotten it. There was an east window in the main room, beside the chair where I sat and read in the evenings. And every morning that window showed me the same stretch of yard and the woods beyond it. A couple of old apple trees, a stone wall going to ruin, the tree line, the mountain falling away past it. I knew that view the way you know the back of your own hand, watched it move through the fall, watched the leaves come down and the first snow cover it all, and the deep winter settle in white and silent. That window was as familiar and as harmless to me as anything in that cabin. Until the winter it wasn't. It was deep in January when it started, the dead middle of the winter. Everything outside buried in 2 feet of old snow and more coming, the nights long and black and bitter cold. One night I got up from my chair to bank the stove before bed, and I glanced out that east window the idle way you do. And I stopped cold with the poker in my hand. Because the window showed me summer, not winter. Not the snow that lay 2 feet deep in my actual yard that I had shoveled that very afternoon. That I could see out every other window in the house. That one east window showed me the yard in full green summer. The apple trees leafed out and heavy, the grass grown tall and going to seed, moonlight lying silver over all of it. The warm dark shimmer of a summer night alive, with the sense of insects humming, though I couldn't hear them through the glass. I stood there a long, long time, the cold of the poker seeping into my hand. Looking at a season that was not happening, that could not be happening, framed in that one window while every other pane in the cabin showed the true white dead of winter. I went and checked the others, the north window, the west, the door, winter, snow, bitter dark. I came back to the east window, summer, green and warm and impossible, and then, standing in that summer yard looking back at me, I saw the man. He stood out there in the tall moonlit grass, a good distance from the glass, a man about my own size and build. And he was facing the cabin, facing the window, facing me. My heart went up into my throat. But even in that first jolt of fear, something about him struck me as wrong in a different way than a prowler would be wrong. And as I watched him and he watched me, the understanding came over me slow and cold and strange. He wasn't standing in my yard, he was standing in his. He was looking out the way I was looking out, looking through his own east window, from inside his own cabin, a cabin that stood where mine stood. I, on a night that was summer, where mine was winter. We were two men at two windows that had somehow, for reasons I will never understand, been set to look through at each other across whatever gap of time or season or something stranger had opened between us. He lifted a hand, slow, and I lifted mine. And across that impossible distance we stood and regarded one another. Each of us, the strange thing in the other's window. I should have been more frightened than I was, but there was something in it that pulled at me instead. Some deep loneliness answered, because I had been so long alone up there, and here was another soul, another man living the same solitary life in the same lonesome cabin, close enough to see. And I found myself going to that window every night after, the way you'd go to visit a neighbor. And the window showed me more of him as the weeks went on. His life, playing out in that green summer world, a season ahead of mine or a season behind, I could never work out which, and it troubled me that I couldn't. I watched him move about his cabin, watched him at his own chores. I watched him sit in his chair by his window, in the evenings the way I sat in mine. Two lonely men keeping each other a strange silent company across the glass. There was a comfort in it at first. I won't pretend there wasn't. In all that white buried silence, he was the one moving thing, the one other life. And I came to look forward to him, but something began to go wrong with him. And I watched it happen slow. The way you watch weather come in from a long way off. He started to look poorly, thinner. Over the weeks he grew gaunt, his face falling in, his clothes hanging loose on him. A man wasting, though I couldn't see any reason for it. And he stopped sleeping. I could tell, because when I'd get up in the deep of the night, unable to sleep myself, and go to the window, he'd be up too, sitting in his chair or standing at his own glass, hollow-eyed, watching. Always watching. And then he began to do a thing that turned my growing unease into something colder. He began to press himself against his window, both hands flat on the glass from his side, his gaunt face close to the pane. And he'd be mouthing something. Urgent. His mouth working hard around words I couldn't hear through whatever separated us. The same words over and over, it seemed. His eyes wide and desperate. Trying with everything in him to make me understand something. And he'd point. He'd take one hand off the glass and point, past me, behind me, into my own cabin, into the room at my back, jabbing his finger at the air over my shoulder. Again and again, his face, twisting with the effort of trying to warn me of something. Something behind me. Something in my own cabin that he could see through that gap and I could not. I didn't understand. God help me, I didn't understand, or I didn't let myself. I'd turn and look behind me and see nothing but my own familiar room, my chair, my stove, the shadows in the corners. I'd turn back to the window and shake my head at him. And he'd grow more frantic, pressing harder at the glass, pointing harder, his silent mouth screaming the same warning I couldn't read. Night after night it went on. Him more desperate each time, wasting away before my eyes, not sleeping, standing at his window, trying to save me from a thing I couldn't see and wouldn't turn to find. Because every night I did the same thing I'd done from the start. The thing that I understand now was the whole trap of it. I watched the window. I was always watching the window. In all those long, lonely winter nights, all my attention, all my fear, all my searching went out through that one east pane into his summer world, onto his warning face, and never once, not really, into the dark of the room behind my own back. Why would it? The window was where the strange thing was. The window was where I looked. The room behind me was just my room, the one place in all the world I was most sure of, the one place I never thought to be afraid of. And so the one place I never truly looked. And then came the night the window changed what it showed me. I went to it as I always did, and the summer man wasn't at his own window anymore. Instead, the glass showed me my own cabin. My own room from behind. It showed me the back of my own head, myself sitting in my own chair, seen from the doorway at my back, as though the window had turned around to look into my own house, from the one angle I could never see. And standing directly behind my chair, directly behind me, close enough to touch me, was something tall. Something that had not been there in any reflection, in any glance over my shoulder. Because it stood in the exact place a man never looks, patient in the blind spot at my own back, where all my long attention on the window had left it free to stand. It was tall, and it was still, and it was leaning down over the back of my chair, over the back of my own unknowing head, and it had, I understood in that frozen instant, been there all along, all those weeks, the whole winter. Standing behind me every single night while I sat watching the window, while the summer man wasted himself away, trying to point it out to me, trying to make me turn around, trying to save me from the thing at my back that only he, through that impossible glass, had ever been able to see. I am writing this fast now because I turned around. When the window showed me at last what he'd been screaming about all those nights, I turned around slow in my chair to look behind me. And in the window, at the very edge of my sight as I turned, I saw the summer man throw back his gaunt head and scream, a real scream this time. His whole ruined face torn open with it, silent still through the glass but unmistakable. The scream of a man watching a thing happen that he spent a whole season trying to stop. I don't know yet what's behind me. I can feel it there. I have felt it there since the moment I began to turn, tall and patient and close, and I understand now why he wasted away, why he stopped sleeping. Why he stood at his glass night after night, pointing and mouthing and begging, because he'd already had his winter. He'd already turned around, and the window had never been showing me another man at all. It had been showing me myself, a season ahead or a season behind, trying across the only gap that would let him through to warn the man he used to be. I'm writing this fast, while it's still just behind me, while I still can. While the glass still glows summer green at my side, showing me the warning I finally understood one night too late. He's stopped screaming now. He's just watching. He knows there's nothing left to do but watch. The way I'll be watching, soon, through my own east window. Some other winter night, some other version of me sitting down in that chair, never thinking to look behind him, because he'll be so busy, the way I was, watching